Welcome back to Close Up. This last week, the White House faced a bipartisan backlash after President Trump's social media account posted a video depicting former President Barack Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama as apes. While Republicans in Washington are normally hesitant to be out of step with the president, in this case, many were quick to condemn what was shared on Trump's account.
Oh, it was racist, and it was inappropriate.
And how do you feel?
And I can't look in somebody's heart or their head. The president says it was a mistake. It was a staffer. I don't think the president's racist. That's not the president that I know. But and I don't know how it happened. You know, the president said a staffer did it, and I believe it. But no fair-minded person can look at that. What do you call it? A meme, whatever you call it. No fair-minded person can. In America today can look at that and not perceive it as racist.
Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina was one of the first to speak up, saying, quote, praying it was fake because it's the most racist thing I've seen out of this White House. The president should remove it. His comments notable because he rarely, if ever, publicly rebukes or disagrees with President Trump. Now, the president says that post was made by a staffer. The staffer has not been identified. Trump later said that individual has not faced discipline, and he referred to the video, quote, as a very strong piece on voter fraud. James McKim from the Manchester NAACP joins us now. James, thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
So a lot to unpack here, as always. But what are your thoughts overall about what unfolded with this?
Well, first of all, we need to state that this video was despicable. It's not something we would expect from the president's office, and not something that we as Americans should expect to come from folks who are claiming to be our leaders. It's not who we are as a country. It's not representative of who we are.
We see so many people now trying to influence the reactions around this, and police people either, saying, well, okay, it's time to move on, or this or that. I'm just curious, do we get too caught up in the debate around these things these days and not finding common ground and a solution to move forward?
I think we do. As humans, we're reactive, and it's a survival mechanism. But I think we need, especially these days, to keep calling out these racist remarks and these racist actions by anyone, really, not just the administration, but anyone. And if we stop doing that, then we give in and we lose our own integrity.
What are your thoughts on, obviously, President Trump behaves a certain way on social media. Basically, if you're in his way, he's going to attack you with everything he's got, whether or not it's him or a staffer. But what do you make of how the world around him reacted to this? It seemed swift and decisive in a way it's normally not.
I think there's a shift. Seeing Tim Scott, for example, Senator Kennedy, even though it was interesting that Senator Kennedy even threaded the needle a little bit and just said, oh, the president's not racist. Well, looking at everything he's done, that says to me that he's racist, and the administration and the people around him as well. But I do see a shift, and the fact that there are Republicans now coming out publicly saying that the president should apologize. That's a shift that's heartening to a number of people.
These things cross over, and obviously social media can be a cesspool, and people say, well, this isn't representative of the so-called real world. I'd like to hear your perspective on that, because obviously people experience the world differently, but is the social media as an outlet amplifying these things into our lives, or is it just reflecting what's always been there?
I think it's a little bit of both. Social media, anyway, is a place that has become it's the virtual world, and so people will gravitate there because their voices can be heard in ways that they could not have been heard outside of the internet world. So it's a place for people to go where they can express themselves and be heard, and more people are just viewing those spaces, viewing in those spaces and getting caught up in it. And it's a little like, I think, about the way television was when television first came about. There were complaints about, well, television is going to indoctrinate everybody. Well, you can turn the TV off. You can turn off social media. We just have to have the discipline to do that.
In terms of building communities, obviously people who want to advance an agenda of hate are doing so on social media. Yes. What's the response from folks who want to build a community that is against hate, I guess, if you will?
Use that same technology to invite people into those online communities where there is a building of love rather than hate. And, we each have to make our own decision as to whether we're going to engage with those people who are putting forth that hate. And for some people, we're ready to do it. For others, it's like, well, we're not quite ready, don't feel like I'm able. It's a difficult conversation. And, you know, we're not taught how to have difficult conversations. And if we do it wrong, we end up making the situation worse. So there's a lot of organizations now, and my organization does this, provides training on how to have difficult conversations in a positive, productive way. Because we still have to really engage with each other. If we don't engage with each other, then we don't move forward.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We were hoping for a bit more of a diversity of political opinion on this program today,
Yes.
but we heard from more than one person who kind of thought about it, and they said, you know, I just don't want to address this right now. You know, people can have any reason they want to do that. That's fine. I was reading, though, about there's a professor at the University of Utah who's written extensively on this, about how confronting and facing racism actually takes a physical toll, that it is enervating.
Yeah.
Explain.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's an old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, words do hurt. And seeing things hurt and causes trauma, causes pain inside. Physical pain, research says that words can cause physical pain. And that's not something that is generally known. That's something that's starting to become more widely known. So when we see these kinds of videos that are doctored and obviously incorrect, they're painting really successful people as being less than. And that reflects on the way that these people who are putting this out look at others of that same group, right? And so that's painful. That is painful. And it's causing people to want to disengage. It's the way that we're being divided.
And all the more important, I guess, to remember the words of Dr. King, never lose infinite hope, right? Even as these things, these difficult things we face in real life and online. Mr. McKim, thanks so much for joining us at Close Up. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, when we come back, Caroline Leavitt on the Save America Act and more news from the State House.